GM executives once drove specially tuned Chevy 400 engines producing nearly 100 more horsepower than what was sold to the public. But why would they hide such a groundbreaking engine's potential? The answer is buried in a web of corporate greed, misinformation, and a shocking campaign to suppress one of Chevy's greatest creations. Let me show you the full story. Before we move on, I will like you to subscribe to the channel and like the video. Imagine this, an engine capable of producing enormous torque, outperforming even Chevy's most celebrated big block motors, all without the need for massive modifications. Now picture what it means when a company as powerful as GM decides to bury this kind of innovation. That's exactly the story behind the Chevy 400 small block, a piece of engineering brilliance that, instead of being celebrated, was quietly left behind. The Chevy 400 was introduced at a time when the automotive world wasn't just shifting gears, it was slamming on the brakes. Faced with stringent emissions regulations and skyrocketing insurance premiums for high-performance cars, manufacturers scrambled to adapt. It was the early 1970s, and muscle cars weren't just losing their muscle. They were gaining a reputation for being impractical. Developing high-output engines in this restrictive environment posed a challenge. But the 400 stood out as a clever solution. It combined the compact small block design with a larger displacement that rivaled big blocks. This was done through a 4.125-inch bore and a 3.75-inch stroke, making it the largest small block Chevy had ever dared to create. On paper, it seemed like a no-brainer. Why wouldn't GM want to push an engine like this? It had the potential to generate massive torque, way more than you'd expect from its size, and could outperform some of the company's beloved big blocks. But instead of marketing the 400 as a game-changer, GM relegated it to an afterthought. Why? Because in the big picture of corporate profits, the 400 posed a problem. The 400 small block was a hidden gem, but much like digging up actual buried treasure, it required work to unlock its full value. GM chose profit margins over performance, backing their larger, pricier big blocks like the 454. These big blocks were far more expensive to manufacture, and their higher price tags ensured bigger profits. The 400, on the other hand, was a disruptor. Its design allowed it to accept virtually any of Chevy's small block cylinder heads, which opened up endless possibilities for customization. Yet GM crippled its versatility by limiting the engine with restrictive emissions equipment. Imagine building a brilliant racing stallion only to saddle it with the heaviest weights imaginable. The potential was always there, but it went unseen, or at least uncelebrated. This neglect didn't go unnoticed even within GM. Take internal memos from the time, where test drivers referred to the 400 as embarrassingly fast for a smog motor. Think about that for a second. Even as they tested the engine under the limits imposed by emissions controls, the 400 still managed to surprise them. In its stripped-down, factory-restricted form, it was already outrunning the expectations of its era. For gearheads and enthusiasts back then, or even today, this kind of performance potential is nothing short of gold. And yet the corporate machine didn't see it that way. The 400 wasn't marketed, wasn't celebrated, and wasn't given the stage it deserved. What makes this story all the more frustrating is the sheer brilliance of the 400's design. It wasn't just a one-trick pony. Engineers gave it a wide bore with a short piston skirt design, which reduced friction and helped it maintain durability under stress. The long stroke design was what delivered that low-end torque, making it a powerhouse for pulling heavy loads or delivering raw performance in the hands of a tuner. Its adaptability with other small block heads meant enthusiasts could unlock huge performance gains with minor adjustments. In a way, the 400 was like a blank canvas. It was ready to be turned into a masterpiece, if only someone were willing to champion it. But GM had other priorities. The big block engines were easier to position as high-performance workhorses, and their higher production costs made them better for the bottom line. It didn't help that the era's emission requirements and rising insurance rates largely discouraged high-performance designs across the industry. The 400, with all its promise, was doomed to be dialed down, sidelined, and quietly pushed as a practical option rather than a groundbreaking innovation. For those paying attention, though, the potential was obvious. And it wasn't just enthusiasts or engineers who noticed. GM's own internal testing frequently showed sparks of brilliance. Anecdotal reports from these early tests talk about astounding torque numbers, mentioning that what the 400 lacked in high RPM horsepower, it more than made up for in sheer low-end power. There were hints that engineers wanted to push the engine further, but corporate priorities held back any real development. All of this brings us to one simple truth. The Chevy 400 wasn't just another engine lost to time. It was a masterpiece stuck in the wrong place at the wrong time. Unquestionably versatile and brimming with untapped potential, it stood out as a shining symbol of what could have been. But company strategy wasn't about celebrating innovation. It was about protecting the status quo, and the 400 threatened the profits tied to GM's big blocks. If that meant sacrificing one of their most forward-thinking designs, then so be it. But here's the thing, this isn't where the story stops. What if I told you the 400's legacy was sabotaged even further? Stick around, because GM's efforts to suppress this engine went well beyond simply ignoring it. What if General Motors didn't just ignore the Chevy 400 small block, but went out of their way to sabotage its legacy? While it's clear the 400 posed a threat to GM's big block sales, the lengths they reportedly went to in order to bury its potential are nothing short of astonishing. To start, GM didn't simply limit the 400's visibility by restricting it to certain vehicles. They actively worked to ensure its strengths would go unnoticed. Rather than slotting the engine into their performance-oriented cars or mid-size platforms, GM placed it in full-size models and trucks. These vehicles, though practical for heavy loads and everyday use, didn't draw the kind of crowd looking for raw speed and power. Performance enthusiasts of the era simply didn't associate full-size sedans or work trucks with high-octane capability, leaving the 400 largely invisible in an era where muscle cars got all the attention. It wasn't just an oversight, this was strategic. By keeping the 400 out of vehicles traditionally viewed as performance platforms, GM steered buyer interest to engines like the flat-out bigger and more expensive 454. But it didn't end with just vehicle placement. GM also intentionally hobbled the 400's abilities with factory-installed restrictive parts. They fitted it with smaller-than-ideal carburetors, conservative camshafts, and exhaust systems that prevented the engine from breathing properly. Anyone who's ever worked on a car knows this is the equivalent of putting a speed limiter on a race car. It frustrates what the engine is truly capable of. These neutered configurations meant the average buyer never got to experience, let alone suspect, the engine's real potential. To comply with emission standards, they used leaner fueling strategies and extremely mild timing curves, choking the engine's output. GM engineers followed corporate instructions to focus on emissions compliance rather than performance. If it feels like the 400 was being deliberately held back, that isn't an exaggeration. It was a textbook example of designing to fail. To put it all in perspective, the 400 was designed for greatness, but smothered at every turn. GM's actions show us more than just neglect. They actively set out to sabotage the engine's reputation to preserve profits from their big block lineup. What's so ironic is that despite their efforts, the 400's brilliance couldn't fully remain hidden. Those who've uncovered it in recent years know the truth. This wasn't just a suppressed engine, it was a masterpiece that corporate strategy kept in the dark. And while GM's actions left the 400 to fade into obscurity at the time, the story doesn't end there. Today, a new generation of enthusiasts is rediscovering its extraordinary design and proving it was decades ahead of its time. The Chevy 400 wasn't just another smog-era engine, it was a masterpiece stifled by corporate greed. What GM suppressed decades ago, modern enthusiasts are now celebrating. With advancements in fuel injection and tuning, these engines are breaking new ground, delivering over 500 horsepower for half the cost of a big block build. Today, companies like Dart and World Products are producing 400 base blocks designed to handle more than 1,000 horsepower, proving the original engineering was miles ahead of its time. So how many other innovations have been buried by corporate interests? Share this story, question the narrative, and keep the 400's legacy alive.